Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Possessed, Revelations of Oblivion. This is a pretty big album for Possessed, considering that this is their first full-length studio album release since 1986. A pretty long gap of time between that project and this one, of course, and when you consider what Possessed did for extreme metal back in the 80s with the two albums that they dropped back then, it's been a really long time since these guys have been in the game dropping a new full-length album. And extreme metal, death metal, thrash metal, whatever type of extreme metal you're talking about has changed a lot since then. I mean, in that time, thrash metal has gone on to evolve a lot, has had lots of new waves and new bands. Death metal pretty much got started completely and has, pretty much everything in its history happened to it in that time. So I was excited to see what Possessed were going to do here on this project. Were they gonna, try to change the game for either of these genres again, or were they just gonna, try to make a decent comeback record that would just showcase that the band still had it in them to make a good album? And overall, this is more so the latter of those two options than anything, as on this project, Possessed aren't really doing anything all too new, or interesting, or groundbreaking, or anything quite like that. However, it is still a really solid and enjoyable record. The sound of this project is definitely more so inspired by thrash metal than it is death metal, especially when it comes to the vocals on this project. They have more of a thrash snarl to them than anything that resembles a guttural growl or anything quite like that. There's even some moments on this project, on some of the hooks in particular, where you get some actual melody coming from the vocals, which is definitely not something you would see from a death metal project for the most part. Which I don't think is a particularly bad thing here on this project, especially considering that I think some of the vocals on this project are some of the highlights on here. I like the really snarly vocals that pop up on this thing. I think the fact that some of the hooks on this project are really catchy does help some of these songs really stand out a lot. In particular, some of the cuts that come rather early on in this album, like No More Room in Hell, or Damned, or even Demon, for example, I think have some of the strongest hooks on this entire project. This album is filled with some pretty solid choruses throughout, and I think the vocals really help sell them for the most part. If you're expecting some really guttural, nasty vocals from this thing, you're not exactly going to get them for the most part. However, I do think the vocals on this thing are pretty solid. They can be a bit typical at times, I will say, and on some of the tracks here, they don't exactly stand out in any particular way, whether it be good or bad, which can be a kind of negative thing at the end. But still, for the most part, they're pretty solid. Lyrically, this album sees Possessed kind of continuing on with a lot of the themes that they've discussed in their previous material, mostly just very evil things, satanic things, things like demons, all that kind of stuff in a kind of cheesy, sort of campy way that they've been doing on their previous records back in the 80s as well. I kind of expected this from them at this point. I wasn't expecting them to, throw us a curveball when it comes to the lyrics on this album or anything like that. And considering these lyrical themes have been talked about so much in metal at this point, I was kind of thinking I was going to be sick of hearing them here on this album, which isn't necessarily the case entirely, that is. I do like the fact that the band, to some extent, sticks with these themes, because considering they were one of the earliest bands to really popularize these kinds of lyrics and things like that, it is kind of like, them returning to this sound. It's a kind of nostalgic in a sense, but at the same time, the fact that I have heard these themes as much as I have does make me kind of tired of hearing them here on this project at the same time, for as nostalgic as it could be. Some of the themes on here, some of the lyrics, are a bit redundant. I wouldn't say there's any lyrics on here that are necessarily groundbreaking, or super shocking, or scary, or anything like that. This stuff has been done for years at this point, and none of it is particularly new or groundbreaking. But for the vibe that the band is going for here on this project, I think the lyrics work well enough, and the kind of cheesy, evil lyrics fit nicely with the sound that they're going for. As for the actual sound of this project itself, I think it's one that overall is pretty solid as well. Once again, you have a lot of thrash influence here in the instrumentals. However, I will say that the instrumentals on this thing do run a bit heavier than what you would expect on your typical thrash record. This is maybe where some of the more death metal influences start to seep their way into this project. Of course, not the most brutal, heavy of death metal influences, but still death metal influences nonetheless. Along with some really fun thrashy riffs that you get on this project, a lot of the guitar solos that pop up on this thing are really enjoyable as well. Pretty much all the tracks here give you a really standout, enjoyable solo. I wouldn't say that they're anything groundbreaking or anything quite like that, but still, they're really solid, really well performed, and really enjoyable solos overall, which are some of the best moments that you get on this entire album. The production on this project is another thing about it that I think is a really standout aspect to it. For a lot of older metal bands out there that are, still making music in 2019, or just the modern era of music in general, a lot of them have transitioned from some more rough around the edges production that has a bit more grit to it, to a more overproduced style of production that just sounds a bit more modern overall. I'm not the biggest fan of this shift, to be honest, as a lot of times it leaves a lot of these more modern projects sounding a bit sterile, a bit overproduced, and I just don't really care for that sound all too much. However, Possessed avoid that here on this project by still having a really rough sounding record. Not quite as rough as what they were putting out in the A's or anything. This is better produced than that material, but still, it's quite rough around the edges still nevertheless, and I think it does help really sell the very chaotic, evil feel that this album is trying to go for in a really nice way. Overall, the production on this thing, I quite enjoyed it. When it comes to big flaws with this record, I do think that there are some. Most notably, I think this album runs a bit longer than it needs to, and I do feel like some of the tracks in the track listing just are a bit redundant compared to some of the others, and these two things combined together does make the album overstay its welcome, if you will. For an album like this, a pretty straightforward extreme metal project, I feel like 30 to 45 minutes is a pretty good runtime overall. However, this project runs at around 55 minutes in length instead, and I don't really think it needs to. It just overstays its welcome. A lot of the tracks on this thing aren't really doing all too much that's super different from one another. Sure, maybe one track is a bit catchier than another, or maybe one track has a more standout solo compared to the other, but for the most part, all of the songs on this thing are really similar sounding to one another. There's a reason why in this review I haven't really brought up too many tracks individually to talk about, and that's because for the most part, I really don't need to, because a lot of what I have to say about this project applies to either all or the majority of the tracks here in the track listing. And while each individual song here on this project is pretty fine sounding in its own right, I don't think that there's any standout bad tracks on this thing or anything quite like that. Put into the context of the record as a whole, and there are quite a few tracks on this thing that just end up feeling like they're just there to fill the runtime of the album. They're not particularly standout for the most part, especially in the second half or so of this project. Tracks like Ritual and The World and Graven, for example, that come towards the end of this thing, they're just not super exciting songs in my opinion. Not bad tracks, they're performed fine enough. I mean, taken on their own, I think that they'd be decent enough songs. It's just that put into the context of everything else that's going on here, and by this point in the album, I'm just kind of tired already and I want the album to end. And the fact that a lot of these songs have pretty similar structures and run times, and once again, as I said before, lyrical themes, it does also help make a lot of these tracks blend together as a result of that as well. Overall, I think if Possessed were going to take this approach to just really straightforward tracks like this, once again, as I said before, a 30 to 45 minute runtime would have been more ideal than like a 55-minute runtime, as I think this thing just runs on a bit too long. Plus, the opening and closing tracks to this thing, which are like these more atmospheric introductions or conclusions to this project, I think are a bit odd here. I mean, they're fine enough, once again, on their own. I think they do a decent enough job of setting the mood, either to introduce you to the album or to exit you from it, but I just don't feel like they're completely necessary here on this thing. They take up almost 4 minutes of the album's total runtime put together that I feel like would have been better just having been completely removed from the project, because just kicking off this project with some straightforward, hard-hitting metal I think would have been more effective than starting with this more atmospheric introduction that's trying to be creepy and stuff, especially when you consider the fact that what you're getting here on the meat of the album itself isn't particularly creepy or anything like that, because, like I said, it's a bit more campy than it is actually scary with how the band handles their evil lyrics, really. So I just feel like this atmospheric intro and outro, kind of unnecessary overall. I feel like you can cut them out of the album and save some runtime here right off the bat in a really easy way. Overall, I think this album is a pretty solid project. It's an album that I definitely have some problems with. I do wish it was a bit shorter overall and that some of the less interesting cuts from this thing were cut a bit more. Either that or I wish a lot of the tracks on here were a bit more diverse in terms of what they were doing sonically or maybe even lyrically. But still, this album definitely does have its highlights. There's a lot of great solos on this thing. There's a lot of great riffs here too. The vocal performance is pretty solid throughout. It just has a really nice energy to it as well. I love the really rough sounding aesthetic to this thing too, thanks to the production. Overall, it's a pretty decent extreme metal album. I don't think it's quite as good as what Possessed were doing back in the 80s, but still, this album definitely does showcase that the band could drop a good album like 30 years or so after their last, which is a pretty good task in and of itself, really. Not a lot of bands could do that. So the fact that Possessed were able to do that, at the very least, is somewhat impressive, I'd say. So yeah, if you're a fan of extreme metal, you like thrash metal, you like death metal, you just love that metal stuff, then I would say check this album out, because you'll definitely get at least some enjoyment from it. Maybe it won't be like your album of the year or anything, but it's still enjoyable. If you're not really a fan of Possessed or metal, or you're not really familiar with them, I would say start with some of Possessed earlier material from the 80s, the more classic stuff from them, and then maybe check this out. But yeah, that really concludes all I have to say here about this project. Feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below, because of course everything I said here is just my own personal opinion. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. So if you enjoy those kind of things, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.